Hey, Mila Falcha. Welcome to Irish Granny Helen. We are reading our Saturday book. This is video number 2, Sympathy Vote, and a reinvestigation of the Valerie Percy murder by Glenn Wall. Go back and watch video number 1 to get all the background. This is a perplexing case. It's never been solved, which should tell us all that you can have all the money in the world, but it cannot always buy everything you want. Our awareness of criminal behavior has become more sophisticated, and my heart really goes out to especially the identical twin sister of the victim, Sharon Percy. She married wealth. She married into the Rockefeller family. She has been very prominent and active over the years in social good, but this dark cloud has hanged over their family for decades, and that's very, very sad. So what am I talking about? The murder of Valerie Percy, the young daughter of Senator Charles Percy. So now we're on chapter 6, Saturday. Saturday, September 17th, 1966 at 5 o'clock in the morning. 1 mile west of the Percy house, so this is in the neighborhood, Dr. Frank Piricello's house. He had a wife and 8 children in this house. And was just awake because he was a doctor. He had to get up really early to go to the hospital. And he'd just woken up and he heard a noise on the 2nd floor. And he thought it was in the next room. His wife's dressing room was in the next room, and he heard this noise. They had a pet bulldog, but it slept through everything. He yelled, "Who's there?" He heard something bumping and fumbling in this dressing room. He went in and turned on the light and discovered that the French doors in the dressing room that opened onto a small balcony were open. They had been forced open from the outside, and the screen had been taken off. He saw a teenager riding a bike away. He called the police, and they weren't really sure if he had caught the intruder just breaking in, or if he had been awakened enough to interrupt whatever the intruder was up to, or was the intruder in the process of leaving when the doctor woke up. His daughter later said that the intruder had hung from a gutter outside the wall and pulled it into a V shape and bent it by hanging on it. And there were scuffs on the wall and a footprint in the flower bed. So some people might call this evidence. We'll see. Turns out the guy on the bike was not the intruder. It was the local newspaper delivery boy. In the late evening of the same Saturday, 1 mile to the east, Lorraine Percy came home from driving her son Mark to a sleepover. So she was at home. At 6 o'clock, their daughter Valerie came home from a Republican student meeting at Northwest University. She was working that summer as an aide on her father's Senate campaign. She was the head of the volunteers, and she was instrumental in rallying young people. Personable, charismatic, smart, and really dedicated to her father's campaign. She was a recent graduate of Cornell University, very attractive, very popular, and she and her twin sister looked so much alike. They wore their hair the same, they looked alike. She had also helped 2 years earlier on her father's gubernatorial campaign that failed. But now she had this really important job, and she moved back into the family home. There was plenty of room for the campaign duration. She was really active at Cornell when she was in school there. She went to school in France and in Switzerland for a while. She had a boyfriend named Andrew Potash, whom she met at Cornell. He also worked on the Percy campaign, but then he left for England. I don't want to misspeak. It's been a while since I read this, but I think he was in graduate school in England, but it might have been a job. I can't remember. Not all that important, but he was in England when all of this happened. Valerie was getting ready to leave to do a post-grad stint at Johns Hopkins University. And the campaign was almost over. We're talking September. Her bedroom was one of 5 bedrooms on the second floor. And there was access to it from a rear hallway. And there were French doors with a balcony in that hallway. There was another stairway that led up to the 3rd floor where Roger Percy, her younger brother, stayed. Younger, he was 3 years younger, where he stayed in the attic. Not like Sarah Crew. I'm sure it was nice. But he wasn't home. He was busy driving west to visit his family in Southern California for a month, and then he was going to go on to college at Menlo Park. So he was moving on with his life. His room upstairs was empty. Also on the 2nd floor was with Valerie was a master bedroom. 11-year-old Mark had a bedroom. 13-year-old Gail had a bedroom, and Sharon. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bedrooms all occupied. Sharon was home also temporarily. Sharon had graduated from Stanford, and she had also studied in Switzerland, and she was just home from graduate school. She had been on a gift trip to Congo and had caught malaria while she was there. So she had come home, she was recovering, but she was still, not feeling the best. That night, she borrowed Valerie's raincoat and went to a political rally in the city. So Sharon is the one going out that night. And her mother is home, Lorraine. Her younger sister is home. Her little brother is at a sleepover. Her older brother's on the way to college. So Valerie and the mother and the younger sister at home alone for a while. She ate dinner with 2 campaign workers that were roommates of each other, a guy called Tim Drescher and another guy called Tully Friedman. He was actually 24 and he was dating Valerie. So, her boyfriend was in England, so she was dating this other guy. The 2 guys left at 10:15. Valerie went upstairs to her room, put on a nightgown and watched TV. An hour later, her sister Sharon, who was on the mend, came home, went into Valerie's room. Valerie was in bed. She returned the raincoat, and they chatted for a while, and Sharon left the room, shut the door, and went to her own room. 20 minutes later, Charles Percy, Senator Percy, returned home. He was driven in a big Buick by his aide, Neil Burghardt. Burghardt showed up at Percy's house in 1963 and sought him out and said he really wanted to help in any way he could in his run for office. He volunteered to work on his campaign. And he had tracked Percy down, and Percy was well known around Chicago as a businessman. It wasn't hard to find him. Having been named president of Bell and Howell at the age of 29, 13 years later, it had grown 3 times bigger under his guidance. So he was a workaholic. He had a reputation for being clean. He wouldn't swear. He would say, "Gall darn it." Anyway, this young guy admired him, and I suppose he wanted to tie himself to his coattails, but it was a career opportunity. So Senator Percy came in, watched TV with his wife for an hour, and they were asleep by 1:30 in the morning. That morning, that day, he had done a half-mile swim in the lake with a distance swimming team. He did a lot of I guess you'd call them PR type photo op type things. He was a real athletic guy. So he went swimming with this group of distance swimmers, just to prove how young and vital he was for his campaign. Now we're on chapter 7, 9/1866. There were no recorded calls because there was no 911 until 1976, and it wasn't everywhere at first. But a lot of people recorded the time of this event because when they woke up with what was going on, they noticed the time. So reports of exactly what time it was to the minute are contradictory because everyone's clocks, they were all different. But shortly before 5 a.m., the house was quiet. It was dark outside because it was quite cloudy, even though it was September. Lorraine said she was woken up by a noise and then footsteps, and she thought that it was one of the children, and she went back to sleep. This is not in this book, but I have, like I said, I've thought about this, I've paid attention to this for a very long time. In her testimony, what she really said was she woke to the sound of breaking glass, and she thought it was one of the kids down in the kitchen had dropped a glass. She didn't think anything of it, and she just went back to sleep. Then shortly afterwards, she wasn't quite asleep, she heard a moan. And she thought it was someone sick, and she thought it might be Sharon, because Sharon still had malaria. And then, kind of half asleep, she heard a second moan, and that got her attention. She got up in the dark. She thought that Sharon was still recovering, and maybe she was vomiting, or, maybe she had pain. So she got up, and on her way to Sharon's room, she heard the moan again, and it was coming from Valerie's room. So she walked into Valerie's room and called Valerie's name, and walking in, she saw there was a light on under the door. So she went in, she opened the door, and saw a man leaning over the bed with a flashlight. And in the light, she saw he had a shirt or a jacket with wide checks, and it was short for him in the arms, and he wore trousers and a dark belt. He blinded her with the flashlight. He shined the flashlight right in her face. And she could only see his outline behind the flashlight and the shape of his head and his hairline. She froze, which is a very common response. She froze. She didn't know what to do. She wasn't thinking clearly. And he froze. He just stood there, and they stared at each other for a minute. And she heard Valerie moaning, but she was frozen in fear. And so they stared at each other, she said, for like a horrifying moment. And then she screamed and slammed the door. Like, she wasn't in the room, she was at the doorway. She slammed the door. And she raced down the hall to the master bedroom. As she was running, she thought she heard the guy running the other direction to the turret area. So what I neglected to mention, because it didn't seem important, downstairs there was a portion of a wall in the house that was like a turret shape, and the living room area was on the first floor, was in this turret shaped place, and she thought she heard the footsteps going in that direction. So Senator Percy was jarred awake by his wife screaming, and she was screaming, "She's been stabbed, call the police." Then she flipped the alarm, and everybody in the neighborhood woke up. All the floodlights went on, the siren went on outside, the alarm went on in the inside, the whole family woke up. Percy ran to Valerie's room, and he said later it was a scene of horror. That the right side of the bed and the right side of her were completely covered in blood. He switched off the alarm to make the call to the police so that they could be heard. They got their daughters, Sharon and Gail, away from Valerie's room into the master bedroom. Everybody's freaked out. The cops were only 7 blocks away. So Vernon Roddy, remember him? He was the first police officer on the scene. 5:05 in the morning. Chuck Percy's daughter was seriously injured. This is what was the call. And he's very upset. Go see what's going on. So Roddy radioed Gary Wolfe on patrol. So Roddy is the guy in charge, and Gary is in the car. And Gary sped to the house, and then Roddy did too. And they got the neighboring police to form a perimeter immediately in the neighborhood. He got on the phone and he called Chief Daly at home, who lived 2 blocks from the station. There was pandemonium at Percy's house. Lorraine was trying to help Valerie, but she had no pulse. She was already dead. So after calling the police, Percy ran down the back stairs to try to catch the intruder. The side door that he'd come home through was still locked from the inside. The front door was locked from the inside. So interestingly enough, they had just hired a butler because, you know, everybody needs a butler. And this butler had just been hired 10 days ago. His name was Henry Whitting, and he was, I believe he was English. And he was asleep over the garage in the apartment, the servant's apartment. Percy called for him, and Whitting woke up. When he heard the calling, he looked out the window from above the garage and could see absolutely nothing from his windows. Percy began to search the first floor, and Lorraine switched the alarm back on now that the phone calls had been made. Percy found nothing disturbed, nothing stolen, apparently, nothing disturbed. Until he got to the family room, and then he found a seldom used French door behind a piano. So they never used the door. It wasn't going anywhere important. I think it went out into the patio, and they had pushed a piano up by it. I guess there was still a narrow opening. Yeah, it was narrowly opened, and it had been blocked by the piano bench, but everything was pushed around. He saw about an 18 by 24 section of glass smashed out. That was the glass that Lorraine had heard broken. And interestingly, they discovered later that this glass had been neatly cut with a glass cutter to weaken it and then smashed. Several pieces of screen had also been cut away to access the glass. And this exited to a patio that was just below Valerie's bedroom. Percy saw nobody, saw nothing. But then Richard Speck came to mind. Does anybody remember that case? This was a weird year. The case of Richard Speck, the drifter weirdo merchant marine guy who murdered 8 nurses in a kind of a dormitory, nursing students in Chicago. When Percy thought about this, he freaked out. And he was really afraid that the intruder was still hiding in the house. He and Whitting went upstairs, and they escorted Lorraine and Sharon and Gail to the master bedroom, made sure there was nobody in there, locked them in safely. And they turned the alarm off again because help was coming, and it was just sensory overload. Whitting stayed with the women. Percy searched upstairs. Then he went downstairs. Lorraine came and followed him downstairs. They went to the garage, and they let their 8-year-old dog out. It wasn't a watchdog. It slept in the garage. Poor dog. I felt bad for the dog. Percy didn't remember if the door from the hallway to the garage was open or closed when he went downstairs. He just couldn't remember. Later, when he was interviewed. The dog roamed the grounds. The dog was usually in bed in the far end of the 4-car garage. It had a doggy door that could go in and out to an outdoor pen if it needed to go out in the middle of the night. But, you know, it was old and it usually just slept. So the police officer in the car, Wolf, he arrived in 7 minutes. And the dog held him at bay because of his uniform. The dog did have a little life in him, you know, and he wouldn't let him approach because he was in a uniform. So Percy got the dog and confined him. And Officer Wolf came in through the pool house, and they went up the back stairs and down the hall to Valerie's room. And Wolf then phoned Roddy. So actually, Roddy wasn't the first person there. He was the first person to find out about it. Wolf was the first person there. And Wolf told him, you know, there's been a murder and it's horrific. So Percy got dressed. Fire trucks from Winnetka showed up. They tried to give emergency help. They carried in a stretcher. And Wolf called Roddy to call the doctor. We think about now the kind of instantaneous help we get from EMTs and the fire department, and there was none of that. So Percy suggested, wait a minute, my own doctor lives right down the street, 2 doors down. So Wolf, the cop on the scene, went down to the neighbors to talk to the doctor. So now we're on chapter 8, the doctor. 3 days later, the doctor told this story, that he and his wife woke up to the burglar alarm outside, the sirens blaring from the Percy house. And his wife went outside to look, but he just looked out the window, a little less concerned. His wife saw nothing, and then the siren stopped, and so they thought it was okay. But the Percy floodlights were on, were not on at this point, because, they turned everything off. And, but the floodlights for the house next door were on. Then Percy called him on the phone and said, come over, Valerie's injured. So Annie told him, there's a cop coming to get you. So he got dressed really quickly. The police officer, Wolf, told him what was going on. He said, don't even stop to get your bag, come quickly. And he thought to himself, this must be desperate. So he asked what happened, and the cop said, I don't know, there was a girl that was stabbed. So they saw Percy's lights on outside the front door, and the front door was open. They saw a man that he didn't know. The doctor saw this man he didn't know was the butler. He hadn't met him yet. He rushed upstairs, and he said this girl was obviously dead, and she had not just been stabbed. She had been badly beaten. Her face was lacerated. Her left eye was closed. That's how they knew, it was swollen, so she was beaten first. Badly disfigured around her head and neck. He didn't even recognize her, and he knew her well. And he told her parents, she was gone. So Percy got on the phone and called somebody associated with his Christian Science church. And a couple from the church arrived to be with the children. The doctor felt that a lot had gone on here before he arrived. Chuck was fully dressed. The butler had made coffee. The Christian Scientists had been called and were there. And he speculated maybe, did this new household help do this? Did this new butler do this crime? And he asked Chuck about what else might have happened to Valerie, and Chuck asked him, what else might have happened to Valerie, and the doctor said no. So more police arrived, and at 6:15 that morning, the doctor went back home. So chapter 9, the dreadful news. So Hoff, the doctor, had seen a man with a bag, and like a doctor's bag, and he realized this must be Clarence Minima, who was the coroner, and he figured he must have been called by the police. This particular coroner was often used by the police for emergencies. At the same time that they had called the coroner, they had also called Dr. Hoff. So this is not clear, but I'm guessing they called Hoff from the house, and Vernon probably called the coroner, as they usually did, from the station. So he'd come over, and then the chief arrived. He arrived at the station. He lived 2 blocks away. He sent Vernon Roddy, to the house now to help Wolf. And on the drive over, he watched the roads. Maybe he would see the killer on the streets. He saw a young guy on a motorcycle going away from the Percy's direction, speeding. And he pursued him for a few blocks and eventually was able to pull him over. And he said he wasn't a nice guy, but there was no sign of him having been in any kind of a struggle or a killing. So he arrived at the house. He said it was horrible. There was so much blood on the walls, it went all the way to the ceiling. Roddy went down the back stairs to check outside, and he saw footprints leading down the bluff through the yard and the patio, where he'd entered the house, so where the bad guy had entered the house. So he had obviously come up from the beach and then sprinted back down. There was a strong wind, and that may have been one of the reasons why the dog didn't do anything. The dog was a little old and didn't wake up. Some authors have sensationalized the events in the scene, but Dr. Hoff always said it was really straightforward. There just wasn't a lot to say. Sharon, of course, was inconsolable. I can't even imagine. And the family was in complete shock. But Percy was in control, and this is not surprising. CEO, a senator, and a guy with a real strong religious context. It's interesting how it helped him. He was in control. He was organized, and he knew that he needed to get in touch with his sons, one on the way to Menlo Park, one sleeping over with friends. So he got a friend from Bell and Howell in California to drive to the university and find his son Roger and tell him in person. So the friend immediately drove the son to the airport, and they both forgot their wallets. And this is just, boy, the sign of the times. Wait till you hear this story. They get to the airport. They have no ID, either of them. They made a quick dash to the airport gate, and the friend, whose last name was Roberts, told the gate agent, "I have to get this young man on this plane." He pointed to a billboard located near the corporate headquarters and told him, "This is where I work, and would it be, see that sign?" He says, "I'm president of that company, and I'm good for the money." And the oldest son, Roger, was in shock. The agent let him on the plane. "It's okay, I'm good for the money." No ID, nothing. Let him on the plane. Percy family and friends gathered. Church people showed up. Others arrived. They're all listed in the book. Lorraine's sister-in-law was a member of the J.C. Penney family. These people were loaded. And she ran the J.C. Penney Foundation. This is Lorraine's sister-in-law, married to her brother. So Lorraine's brother worked for the UN, Save the Children Fund. They've got tentacles everywhere. And Sharon, her boyfriend, was Jay Rockefeller. Yes, those Rockefellers. And he was running for Wisconsin House, the House of Representatives. So because it was Sunday, most local and Chicago papers and the media, they had to scramble for staff to have, delay putting things on. This was a huge story, huge. Imagine, Neil Burkhart, the driver, heard on the radio, and he said this moment in our world was like 9/11. People were in shocked disbelief. He said, we'd been together 8 hours earlier. He cried all day. He said he was just devastated. He didn't know what to do, and he didn't want to bug the family, so he just planned on Monday morning to show up at the house as he would any Monday morning to give Charles a ride. Meanwhile, 1 mile west of the Percys, the cops were again called to the Frank Piricello house, where the invader had cut the screen and broken in. And the story morphed. So this is what happened. So Piricello's had this break-in. They find out about Valerie being stabbed. They call the cops back and say, "Okay, look at this." And the story morphed into Valerie's killer had broken into the Piricellos the day before killing Valerie. Well, maybe. We don't know yet. Everyone was scared. He's out there somewhere. Who's he going to hit next? So chapter 10, no leads at all. 2 hours after the murder, the Chicago Police Crime Lab was at the scene. They were called. Because this is a small town, they didn't have the ability. They called the Chicago police in. Half an hour before that, Roddy was the first to interview the parents, and he said they just cried. It was impossible to talk to them. At the end of his shift, he was relieved by William Sumner. Kenilworth had no detectives, and they decided to reach out to bigger agencies. And this is very common even today. You know, not every local community has the money for highfalutin forensics and profilers and detectives with experience, and so they will reach out. A lot of states have a bureau akin to the FBI on a state level. The GBI, here, now listen to true crime, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, that would be an example. So they reached out to bigger agencies. The Chicago forensics guys came, off-duty cops showed up. There were lots of rubberneckers in a crowd outside on the road, and it grew. And you can see pictures of it in some of these pictures in this book. And I wonder, how carefully did they look at that crowd? And there were gawkers going by the house for weeks after. Dr. Hoff's son, Bob, who was a teenager, was surprised at the difference between what he heard his father say that he had experienced and what actually got reported. What they wrote was not truth. There was a lot of exaggeration. And the doctor got mad because he was being misrepresented in the press. He stopped talking to reporters. Percy's campaign staff arrived, and, they're hoping to help console the family. His press secretary, Scott Cohen, spoke for the campaign. He became the official spokesperson. Remember, his daughter was working on this campaign. Lorraine's brother, David Geyer, spoke for the family. A telegram came with condolences from the opponent who'd had the heart attack, Senator Paul Douglas, and his aide was Dick Durbin, who was in college at the time and was his aide. Described Douglas's shock and him going to church to pray. And this is his, political opponent. He went in and prayed for the Percy family. He walked out the door and said in quiet tones to his staff, "This campaign is over until Chuck Percy announces it will resume." So this is his political opponent because it's a campaign going on. And he said, "I'm suspending my campaign until my opponent is capable of re-campaigning. And we'll say nothing about this tragedy other than to express our sympathy to the family. My heart goes out to you over your cruel and terrible loss," he said in this telegram to the family. Then he made an announcement of his own. The three-term Democrat said he was suspending his campaign immediately and indefinitely as a result of the killing. Through his press aide, Percy soon announced that he would do the same. There would be no campaigning in the race for Douglas's Illinois seat for the foreseeable future. Meanwhile, investigators from Kenilworth, surrounding communities, and the Chicago Police Forensics Unit extended their services and their search for evidence inside the Percy home. And I suppose I misspoke because I called him Senator Percy all the time. Well, now that's his title, but this was before the election, so. Okay. Where am I? There was an extensive search that went on around the grounds, the beach, the lake. They had explorer scouts help with the search. They had Coast Guard. Meanwhile, Roger, finally from college, landed at O'Hare. Jay Rockefeller arrived. The family were kept in the master bedroom because the house was being searched. The kids were allowed to go into the yard with their aunt, but that was it. Mortuary hearse arrived, and her body was loaded inside the garage, out of sight of everybody. The police chief escorted the hearse past the press and through the gates. She was taken to the Cook County morgue for the county pathologist. This is typical in a murder. And the crime scene was handed over to the Chicago police. They did fingerprinting, photos, blood evidence, vacuuming of sand in the footprints. They found a leather palmed wool glove in the shrubs. They found a moccasin on the beach near the Percys. They had no police dogs available. The summer had been huge for news, and the UPI was slim on staff that Sunday. The reporters were shocked by the chaos. When this one reporter got to the house, she was absolutely shocked at the chaos at work as well. You know, the office was in almost as much turmoil. She said, "We're going out of our minds. We could hardly believe that something happened to the Percy family." The news was all Percy all the time. The Percy parents sneaked out the back door to the beach and eluded the press. They got into a limo that had waited for them at the neighbor's house, who were their friends, and went to the funeral home to make funeral plans. That evening, Chief Daly held a press conference. No leads, no clues. They did have some, though. This was an aside. They had the cut glass. The fact that it was cut precisely sounded, I don't know, experienced. The glove that they found in the bushes was smeared with a bloody palm print on the banister, smeared with maybe blood. They weren't sure, but it was wet. And then the moccasin that they found on the beach. The chief had planned to retire this month. McDonough was done with his job for the summer. He took a camera over and caught groups of people outside, including police and Daly and explorers. He was done. He thought this was his last day, but the next day he got rehired to help on the phones and the radio until November, temporarily, because it was a zoo. The campaign staff feared this might have been a politically motivated murder, and they feared another attack on the family. And Percy said, no, it's not possible. Some of his staff took precautions anyway. One of them went around armed with a golf club. The neighbors were terrified, especially because the killer just walked up from the beach, probably. Yeah, that's what they think. Malcolm Caskey from Winnetka, a police officer and a former Marine, he'd been familiar with the neighborhood because the Kenilworth Department was happy to have him come and be a backup, so he came back to help them. Now we're on chapter 11, A National Story. On Sunday night, until midnight, at midnight, Roddy's shift began. The building was full of reporters. They camped out all night there. The eyes of the nation were on Kenilworth. The police chief warned them, the employees, burn your notes and burn the office trash because the press is going to get into everything. We don't want them interfering with the investigation. Burkhart, he prepared to drive Percy anywhere. The car that they drove the senator campaign guy around in had a crude version of a 1960s cell phone. It only got 2 channels, and you had to wait your turn to use it, but, He himself was devastated. He thought of Valerie as a sister. I mean, she worked with him, and they were close. His granddaughter, many years later, reminded him of Valerie. It was still painful decades later. He says Percy's place was crawling with police. There was even a police officer at the table to receive endless deliveries of flowers that showed up. This is a prominent family, very well known, and actually really well liked. A UPI story, United Press International story, in the Bennington Banner updated readers. Daly's 10-man police force, aided by Chicago's homicide cops, FBI crime technicians, Cook County Police, and members of neighboring suburban police, continued to question the hundreds of friends and associates of the vivacious murder victim. The FBI's primary role was to assist the Kenilworth police in out-of-state and international leads. Then it goes on to name all these people and the details that were put in, like the New York Times. The intruder broke in without waking the family dog. A pane had been cut out, and they said it might have been a pane of glass, might have been muffled by the drapes, but actually Lorraine heard it falling. So there was an extensive collection of forensic evidence. The estate was being guarded. Percy said, now this is where it's very interesting how his worldview affected his attitude. He was being really strong, and people were like, how are you coping? He goes, we cannot hate the man who did this because he's one of God's children and he believes in forgiveness. But Burkhart, the driver, he wanted revenge. There was a very unsophisticated investigation process at the time, and not remotely like what they would do today. This autopsy is bizarre. She'd been stabbed in the liver and the heart and the throat, but she had bites on her fingers. Her death was from severe blows to the left side of the head that shattered her skull. It was a triangular depression from a metal object. She had no drugs or alcohol in her system. Some wounds were atypical, and the coroner said the pathologist said this is not this guy's first act of violence. In fact, he was sure it was not the first time he'd killed somebody. And absolutely she'd been bludgeoned before being stabbed. They searched the lake for a couple of days. They checked the points of, the patients of nearby mental hospital that was half mile down the road. The place that William Thornton had escaped from. So now we're going back to all that stuff I talked about in video 1. The hospital he escaped from years before, they went back and checked that. They said it's kind of like a North Shore resort. It's where the wealthy clients went to dry out. It was like a rehab. But there was some overlap with people that had real problems. The patients were rich. He said a lot of the patients that were there that weren't rehabbing were such a stereotype. Wealthy women going through depression, or they were sad because they were divorced. This is what the cops said. On the second floor, they put the house under lock and key. Wait, no, I'm sorry, I said that wrong. The facility, the mental facility, was under lock and key. That's where patients were kept that might be problematic. That's where William broke out of. This facility went broke in the late 60s. So shortly after this murder. At Percy's house, the police questioned 28 people. On Monday, the family were allowed access to the whole house again. Before that, they were consigned to the master bedroom. Many people dropped off gifts, usually food from the neighbors. The family bought a huge killer guard dog immediately. Guests had to call ahead, and the dog had to be locked up before they came over. Roscoe Drummond, a Christian Science Monitor, that's their paper, reporter, and a family friend dropped by unannounced, and he said the dog tore through a screen door to get at him. And Roscoe was just 5 feet tall. The dog was huge. The dog jumped up, put his paws on Roscoe's shoulders. He was as big as Roscoe was tall, and licked Roscoe's face, at which point they got rid of the dog. So Lorraine gave a description of the man she saw. He was about 5'7", about 150 pounds. He had dark hair. He had on a light shirt or jacket with a check pattern. And she noticed the sleeves were up, so they might have been rolled. She wasn't sure. Close family friend Donald Rumsfeld came and spoke to the police. McDonough returned to work to help, that, kind of never left from his temporary job. He said it was chaos. It was a hive of activity. There were snoops and reporters and GOP dignitaries and lots of law enforcement from all over the place. There was much excitement for an employee who wasn't directly involved with the family. He didn't really know them. And he said this was a brief brush with national attention, that there was this illusion, on the part of everybody involved in the police department that they were important. And it was said it was really unusual to observe something this significant up close. By late Monday, things began to calm down just a little bit, and there were no new developments for the press. They got tired of hanging around waiting. There was nothing new to say. Early on, casual encounters like paper delivery or riders on a train who might have met her and been obsessed, they were all eliminated. Somebody reported seeing a man watching the Percy house a few hours before the murder. I believe this is significant. Then a strange man was seen about a quarter of a mile down the beach late on Saturday afternoon. More questionable about the significance. It was a public beach. But this guy was sitting in the woods or the trees watching the house. The chief gave several press conferences but had nothing new to say. On Monday night, there was a wake at the funeral home, and even Valerie's boyfriend, Andrew Potash, he flew in from England to be there. I can't imagine how hard that must have been for these people. He met briefly with reporters. They scribbled down what he had to say. He'd known her for 4 years. Then there was a question about their relationship, and he stood silently for 30 seconds looking at the ground, and he said, I'll say one thing. Valerie was the most beautiful person I ever met, and that's in the highest sense of the word, in the more spiritual sense of the word. She had very high ideals, something that the rest of the young people in America should look up to. When asked whether they planned to marry, he said, I'm not going to deny it or confirm it. I'm not going to talk about it at all, at least for a couple of days. I don't want to talk about Valerie and me and what we meant to each other. Gentlemen, he said, I'm quite upset. I think that's all for now. And walked away. Interesting. Percy tried to console everybody. He was the one going around trying to make everybody else feel better. And especially the young campaign workers. These were Valerie's friends. They were her peers. In many cases, she had sort of recruited them. She was their boss, their organizer. They made kind of a position statement for the press and said, as a group, the campaign, that life will go on and it will be worth living. CBS postponed airing the movie Psycho. You can figure out why. Finally, it got shown in New York in 1967, but it was never shown nationally the way they had planned. It was just too upsetting for everybody. Okay, chapter 12, No Suspects. Kenilworth had no serious crime ever since this moment, and it was besieged by reporters in the yards, in the driveways, in the neighborhood, wailing citizens looking for a story. Dr. Hoff in his driveway, he was just tortured by reporters. He told the surgeon for the he is the surgeon. He told a reporter for the Tribune that Valerie suffered numerous and very disfiguring stab wounds. Anyone doing that kind of violence has some sort of abnormal drive, and I'm convinced this is some intimate adult activity motive behind it. Not culminating in any kind of act, but the FBI would call it motivated by a perversion. He says this atrocity was committed by some deranged person. He says, I was over there to the scene in 1 or 2 minutes and went immediately to Valerie's room. I was amazed at the composure of her parents and how they handled themselves. He couldn't figure out why nobody 2 days later He waited and waited. The police never contacted him. And he was never asked to give a statement. He was further troubled the following month when he was not invited to the coroner's inquest. Though he was the first doctor on the scene, he's the one who declared her dead. To Hoff, the investigation seemed to be managed in a way that it should not have been. In other words, mishandled. There was now a 24-hour guard at the Percy house, but they had no suspects. They looked at her boyfriend. They looked at Calvin Fentress, 28, who was a speechwriter for Percy, kind of a quiet guy who was a bookworm. They looked at Valerie's diary. Nothing. And the Coast Guard was still searching in the lake. This is interesting. Christian Scientists don't have funerals. So the family determines what kind of a service they will do. So because Percy's were so known, they knew that a lot would be expected. People would be expecting something. So they had a memorial service on Tuesday, September 20th at the Kenilworth Union Church, which is non-denominational. There were over 400 people, 300 in the main room and a spillover of 100 more in a nearby area with speakers. Many politicians showed up. Valerie was cremated, and they had a small graveyard service for her with the family. Jay Rockefeller stayed and slept with Roger, the brother, in his attic room. This is Sharon's boyfriend, and later became her husband. So I'm going to end here. I don't want to start a new chapter and a new part of the story, and it's almost an hour. Sorry to cut it a few minutes late. So this is the end of video 2. And we'll start number 3 here next. And I hope this story is compelling. I think the comparison of how crimes were handled. I think the way in which the family dealt with this is interesting, unique. I'm not being critical. I'm just saying that they had an awful lot of composure and dignity. I thought that was interesting. All of the big names, I mean, Donald Rumsfeld was their close friend, please. And the Rockefellers and J.C. Penney's, that family, and it just goes on and on. So I hope you're enjoying it, and, please do let me know, and I'll be back, and thank you very much. Oh, be sure you're subscribed. My subscriptions are hilarious. It's like watching somebody with a bad heart, it's up and down and up and down. Please subscribe. The more you do a thumbs up or comment or subscribe, then the more YouTube puts forward the videos and more people get to see them. And that's the goal here. So thank you very much for your support. I really appreciate everybody who joined my membership. I hope you're appreciating the extra content. And I was going to do a Valentine's live, and imagine my shock when I sat down and started to do the whole computer thing, and they announced to me, oh, well, sorry to tell you this, but the process includes a 24-hour waiting period. I had no idea. So it's always something. I'm trying to be zen about it. I have no expectations of the computer. I'll be much happier. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back. Slan Gafoil, Slanja.